Social Sciences and Department of Economics at SNDT Women's University and Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. I also wanted to offer a special thanks to Padma of Sehat and Sarojini of Sama Women's Health Group in Delhi for their help as I prepared this lecture. I would also like to thank the U.S. India Educational Foundation for making my stay in India possible. Well, I'm extremely honored to have been asked to give the Anusandhan Trust Krishna Raj 7th Memorial Lecture on Contemporary Issues in Health and Social Sciences. I'm also particularly honored that Maitri Krishna Raj has come from Bangalore to be here today. When I was asked to give this lecture, I immediately said yes. It felt like such a wonderful honor. Well, I met Krishna Raj only once, unfortunately, but at least I got to meet him once in the early 1980s in the offices of EPW. Though I was young and only beginning my career as a political writer, researcher, and activist, excuse me, I remember how Krishna Raj took me seriously, and that made all the difference. I know that many, many other young people had a similar experience. Encouraging and nurturing the next generation was one of his many considerable talents. And actually, as I've been talking to friends here and in Delhi, people repeat that story, how he took them seriously, how he walked them to the elevator, and how they got their first article published, and how that made all the difference. Well, I admired Krishna Raj for many reasons, but for the purposes of this lecture, one in particular stands out. Under his leadership, EPW took the lead in exposing India's harsh population control policies. As his obituary in the Guardian newspaper notes, during the 1977 emergency, Krishna Raj, quote, wriggled past the censor the first horrifying details of Sanjay Gandhi's forced sterilization plan. For his courage and outspokenness, he was accused by the government of sedition, charges which were later dropped. And over the years, it was in the pages of EPW where population policies came under close scrutiny by scholars and activists in the women's and people's health movements. More broadly, the EPW played and continues to play a key role on the national and international stage in developing and promoting cutting-edge work in women's and gender studies. And as many of you know, Maitri Krishna Raj played a leading role in that development, as did Padma Prakash, who is also here today. And I'm honored to be here with Padma too. I know of no other magazine like EPW in the English-speaking world. It bridges so many divides between theory and praxis, research, policy, and activism, and different and competing political perspectives. At its heart always remains Krishna Raj's deep commitment to social, economic, and political equality, and his radical humanism. He never lost sight of the concrete impact dominant ideologies and policies have on the lives and livelihoods of India's poorest people. So today I want to talk about how his kind of radical humanism is what is required to challenge and transform the ways in which population is conventionally taught in Indian high school and medical textbooks. Now, while I focus on the Indian context, I first want to describe how we face similar challenges in the United States, very similar in fact. I first became interested in population education at the high school level when my own daughter brought home her biology textbook. I skipped to the section on human population. Side by side were two photographs depicting the impact of population growth in third world countries. One of a picture of a herd of cattle overgrazing the land. The other, the image of a starving black African child. The authors ominously warned, quote, either we will voluntarily reduce our birth rate or various forms of environmental resistance will increase our death rate. facing the problem of how to limit births is politically and emotionally difficult, but continued failure to do so will be disastrous. The book even counseled against lenient immigration policies to the United States, since they would delay national population stabilization. So this is what my daughter was reading in a relatively liberal town, in a relatively liberal high school with a relatively liberal teacher. My students at Hampshire College, where I've taught for over 25 years, frequently tell me that this is what they learned in high school too. They come to college believing that world population is still growing exponentially, and that population growth is the main cause of hunger, poverty, environmental degradation, and political instability in the developing world. And now it's even being blamed for climate change. Now, to help counter these myths, we initially did 2 surveys of the treatment of population in American biology and social studies textbooks. The results were dismal. My daughter's biology textbook wasn't an outlier. We also compared the US approach with UK textbooks, which happened to be better with a more nuanced approach. And ultimately, we decided we needed a curricular resource for teachers, students, and activists that represents multifaceted, gender-sensitive, and rights and justice-centered approaches towards population education. So we made a curricular resource called Population in Perspective. It's now in its 2nd edition with chapters on basic demography, food and hunger, environment, and climate change. It's also been translated into Spanish and adapted for a Bolivian context by the Bolivian environmental NGO Ledema. And both the Spanish and English versions are available free online. Now, has this effort transformed population education in the United States? Well, I certainly wish I could say yes, but I would be lying to you. Given the economic power of the textbook industry, increasing pressure on teachers to teach to the standardized test, and state standards in the US that still mandate teaching about the so-called population explosion, it's a mammoth task to change the dominant ideology. But we believe in the old proverb, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Especially in an age of electronic media, teachers and students find us. People come to know that there is an alternative. And I even had an Indian student from Canada write me. They were about to do a debate on population. I guided her to the resource, and she wrote me back later that they won the debate against the Malthusians, so it made me feel very good. So why is it, one might ask, that population education has changed so little with the times or with demographic changes? In the US case and in the Indian case, as we shall see, the analysis provided by many mainstream textbooks harkens back over 2 centuries ago to the ideas of the Reverend Thomas Robert Malthus, the famous father of the principle of population, as well as the dismal science of economics. And I have a slide change. Okay, great. His intellectual trajectory, I would argue, has much to tell us about the reasons why his ideas are enshrined in our respective nations' schools. Well, in the last decade of the 18th century, Malthus took his first job as a curate in the ancient Oakwood Church that you can see there. It's located in a small village in the southeast of England. Most of his parishioners he served there were poor and illiterate, living in cramped thatched huts and surviving on a diet of bread and little else. Their children suffered from stunted growth. Yet despite these miserable conditions, Malthus noted from studying church records that the number of baptisms was much larger than the number of burials. In other words, there was a so-called surplus of births over deaths. This disparity evidently sparked concern about the evils of population growth. In 1798, he published the first version of an essay on the principle of population. And as many of you know, he maintained that if left unchecked, human populations grow geometrically, while food production at best follows a linear arithmetic path. This condemns humanity to a constant battle to provide sustenance for its growing numbers. Malthus said, "The race of plants and the race of animals shrink under this great restrictive law, and man cannot by any efforts of reason escape from it. So only the ensuing misery of hunger, poverty, disease, and war," he maintained, "keep human numbers in check, along with keeping human numbers in check by increasing death rates, along with some help from moral restraint and vice in keeping birth rates down." Now, even though birth control existed at that time, the conservative Malthus had little truck with it. In his eyes, the poor especially were perpetually doomed to have too many babies, making them responsible for their own misery. Malthus took on the prominent progressive thinkers of his time, men like Marquis de Condorcet and William Godwin, who had more faith in human reason, altruism, and agency, and believed that it was possible to build a more equitable and peaceful world. He lashed out at them for locating the causes of misery and vice in human institutions, insisting that the deeper-seated causes of evil were, quote, "the laws of nature and the passions of mankind." For Malthus, this meant the rich owed nothing to the poor, and the poor, in turn, had no real rights. He also drew a distinction between the industrious, worthy rich and the lazy, undeserving poor. The latter's distress, he wrote, is an evil so deeply seated that no human ingenuity can reach it. Now, of course, Malthusian ideas have changed over time. In particular, neo-Malthusians came to embrace contraception as a means to lower the fertility rates of the poor. But Malthus's basic principle that overpopulation is a major cause, if not the major cause, of hunger, poverty, scarcity, and even war, remains a virtual article of faith in many quarters. It does so because it's tremendously useful to those in power, and it's been useful for over 200 years. In one stroke, it obscures the political economy of inequality, naturalizes scarcity and war, and stereotypes and stigmatizes poor people, turning them into faceless numbers in an archaic mathematical equation. It also performs a certain gender magic, since it is women's sexuality and fertility that is the scourge. Well, 10 years ago, I made a political pilgrimage to that little Oakwood church. As I stood inside the small chapel, I wondered if Malthus might have come to different conclusions if he had bothered to really talk to his parishioners. What if he had inquired more deeply into the real causes of their hunger and distress, and had seriously considered the oppressive forces ranged against them during that particular period of English history? The enclosure of the commons, land dispossession, indecent wages, poorhouses that made a mockery of Christian charity. Maybe then he would have seen that their plight wasn't as simple as a surplus of births over deaths. Instead, his contempt for the poor traveled far and wide, helped along by the fact that he went on to educate colonial officers of the East India Company. Now, unfortunately, Malthusian ideas came to flourish not only in pre-independence India, where, for example, the severe drought of 1877 was blamed on overpopulation by certain British colonial officials, but it also came to dominate in post-independence India, in part because they intersected so well with existing caste, class, and communal prejudices on the part of Indian elites. The idea may have come from abroad. It might have been transferred by colonial elites, but it took root in fertile soil here in India. And as of course you know, in 1952, India became the first country in the world to launch an official population control program. Got another slide. Change. The impetus came from both within the country and from abroad, with rapid population growth viewed as an impediment to modernization by government officials in India, as well as international actors such as the US-based Ford and Rockefeller foundations at that time. Now today, Malthusian ideas permeate the pages of high school textbooks here in a manner strikingly similar to the United States. A report soon to be released by Sama Resource Group for Women in Health on the representation of population in the school curriculum in India reviews 110 social studies textbooks for classes 7 to 12 across India in the year 2012-13. It includes textbooks published by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, the Indian Certificate of Secondary Education, Delhi State Council of Educational Research and Training, and Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and other state educational boards. Sama also reviewed a number of private publishers too. The books selected were adopted after the introduction of the National Curriculum Framework of 2005 and are still in use. Sama's review clearly reveals the overwhelming presence of neo-Malthusian discourses and images in school curricula change. This is taken from a textbook, for example. The textbook's view of overpopulation as the root cause of poverty, unemployment, food scarcity, environmental degradation, inflation, and conflict remains a theme running through many of these textbooks. They mainly blame poor people, women, and other marginalized sections for high population growth rates. The emphasis is on population control as a precondition for national socioeconomic development. Many books also advocate coercive methods of population control. So here's a short sample of quotes thanks to Sama change. So this one says, the implications of population growth for development. Fast-growing population has its own implications as it nullifies all achievement in economic and social spheres and is largely responsible for environmental degradation. It is a Herculean task to provide food, clothing, shelter, health, education, and other facilities to a population which grows at a rapid pace. Change. Suggestions for eradicating poverty in India. Population control. Rapidly increasing population cripples economic development. Thus, the population growth should be controlled. For the purpose of controlling population, family planning measures should be effectively implemented. Change. Another one, for population control, the government should give up political opportunism, make stringent laws, and ensure punishments for those not following them. Change again. Even worse, eugenics is embraced by one. In India, apart from family planning programs, birth improvement programs should also be implemented. Under this, people who are epileptic, hysterical, physically disabled, mentally challenged, morally degenerate, and with genetic and/or hereditary chronic diseases should be prohibited from getting married and producing children. I don't know how many people would be left in the population to have children under that definition. And even widows are targeted. Change. Widow marriages are on an increase in India. This has also increased our birth rate. So I kid you not, and their study should be coming out in a week or two. You can read it yourself. Nor are medical textbooks much better when it comes to teaching about gender and population issues. In 2005, EPW ran a series of articles analyzing the role of gender in major preventive and social medicine textbooks. The authors uncovered gender bias in a number of fields. Some of the texts were not only gender blind but cast aspersions on women. The approaches toward population and family planning are particularly striking. Family planning is primarily seen as an instrument of population control, not as a basic reproductive right. Women are the target, and the role of male responsibility for birth control is almost totally ignored. Park's widely used textbook of preventive and social medicine, moreover, paints family planning as a quick and easy intervention. Quote, family planning programs can be initiated rapidly and require only limited resources as compared to other factors. Another textbook on the same theme by Mahajan and Gupta reveals a cavalier approach to postpartum IUCD insertion. It is inadvisable insert the loop after a child has, it is advisable, to insert the loop after a child has been born. Retroverted uterus is no contraindication. Slight discharge doesn't matter. Mild erosion results in no harm, and prolapse can be ignored. Cervical tear, infection, cesarean section, myomectomy, and lactational amenorrhea are not contraindications. Moreover, the book advises that women with 2 or more children should be motivated for sterilization. Here, I would say, is a disturbing example of how an individual woman's health needs and conditions are totally ignored. Her body is simply a vessel for medical intervention in the service of state prerogatives. The survey texts do not address the ethics of informed consent, the need for counseling, or quality of services. When sterilization incentives and camps are mentioned, it is without criticism. The textbook of Gynecology and Contraception by C.S. Dawn goes so far as to suggest that the one-child policy would be useful here in India to stabilize the population, China's one-child policy. It reinforces stereotypes of the poor and disenfranchised as irresponsible breeders, with a claim that the IUCD is, quote, the most effective and suitable contraceptive for less motivated women, particularly in rural and slum areas in India. Well, now 10 years have passed since this survey of medical textbooks was done, and it would be interesting to know if anything has improved since that time, and perhaps a new survey is in order. However, if reality on the ground is anything to go by, it would seem that not much has changed. Dr. Mohan Rao at JNU Center for Social Medicine and Community Health reports that, quote, interviewing medical students for the MPH program in our center, it is almost invariable that when asked about the major health problems in India, the answers are overpopulation, cancer, and diabetes. Forgotten are hunger, infant, child, and maternal mortality, or communicable diseases. It is not surprising that overpopulation comes first, Rao says, because if I remember Park's textbook of preventive and social medicine, generation after generation of medical students has been taught India contains 2.4% of the total land area of the world and supports 16% of the population. And from talking to people at Sehat in their work on trying to reform medical education, it seems that these ideas are still very much in place. Now, given the way that gender and population issues are taught to medical students who are already imbued with Malthusian thinking from high school textbooks, it isn't surprising that the delivery of family planning services remains rooted in a population-controlled paradigm, with grave consequences for women's health, rights, and bodily integrity. In the same way that Malthus viewed his parishioners as less than human, so too have many Indian health providers been trained to view the poor women they are supposed to serve as unworthy of basic rights. And I'm not suggesting these are evil people, but they have been trained to believe this. First, do no harm, or in Latin, primum non nocere, has, from the Hippocratic Oath onwards, served as a central precept of medical ethics. The Malthusian version distorts the meaning. To prevent overpopulation from harming the nation, harming poor people is justified. And that's what people are learning in high school and in medical textbooks. Or take the words of former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, justifying the coercive population control campaign of emergency rule, the campaign that Krishna Raj spoke out about. She said, quote, we must now act decisively and bring down the birth rate. We should not hesitate to take steps which might be described as drastic. Some personal rights have to be held in abeyance for the human rights of the nation. Those drastic steps, of course, led to the forced sterilization of an estimated 7 million people, mainly poor men. Now, while forced sterilization is no longer standard government practice, Many family planning clinics and camps are the scene of less dramatic and more routinized forms of medical violence directed now at poor women. James Slide. The recent deaths of 13 women in a sterilization camp in Bilaspur, Chhattisgarh, the tip of a much larger iceberg. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're two excellent fact-finding reports. Robbed of choice and dignity, Indian women dead after mass sterilizations by a team led by the Population Foundation of India, and Camp of Wrongs the morning afterwards by a team led by Sama. Both these reports reveal in detail how the Chhattisgarh tragedy must be situated within the larger context of state and national population control strategies that systematically dehumanize poor women by turning them into the faceless numbers behind sterilization targets. These policies also dehumanize healthcare providers by turning them into cogs in the wheel of a vast population control machine. Now, India was a signatory to the 1994 Program of Action of the International Conference on Population and Development, which came out against top-down, target-driven family planning programs and advocated for a broader agenda of women's empowerment and comprehensive reproductive health programs as the way to address population issues. In 2000, the Indian government announced a new national population policy based on free and informed consent and critical of coercion. Yet India still relies overwhelmingly on female sterilization, and states are essentially given free rein to impose sterilization targets, now euphemistically called expected levels of achievement. In 2013-14, the country spent 85% of government family planning expenditures on female sterilization and only 1.45% on spacing methods. Male sterilization, though safer, is almost totally ignored. And the pressure of meeting targets has led to widespread disregard of quality of care standards in sterilization operations, placing a large burden of morbidity and mortality on women. Meanwhile, access to temporary methods of contraception is seriously curtailed, and there is a high level of sterilization regret among women. Now, the Chhattisgarh tragedy, in a sense, is a tip of this large iceberg, and it reveals how these policies can play out in practice. Chhattisgarh has high targets for sterilization, but severe shortages in staff. Family planning is an isolated entity within overall public health services, and practitioners receive virtually no training. Monitoring and supervision are severely lacking, and standards for informed consent are not adhered to. Community health workers are under pressure to motivate women for sterilization and financially incentivized to bring in clients. Doctors are under similar pressures to meet targets, and poor women are paid incentives to be sterilized. Although by middle-class standards the amount seems small, 600 rupees, this compensation money is an attraction. At least that's what one of the reports found. Sterilization operations routinely take place outside of regular clinics and hospitals. Such was the case with the Bilaspur camp. If you read these reports, they describe this as an abandoned hospital. It was dirty, it hadn't been properly cleaned, there was biomedical waste all over the place. One doctor sterilized 83 women in 1.5 hours. This translates into roughly 1 to 1.5 minutes per surgery when it should take a minimum of 5 to 6 minutes. None of the staff changed gloves between procedures, and the same needles were used for all cases. Now, while government standards mandate that 3 laparoscopes should be used for a maximum of 30 patients, only 1 laparoscope was used for all 83 patients, and it wasn't properly sterilized between operations. It is any wonder then that the women developed severe sepsis. And of course there's an attempt to blame it on, the pills that they got after the operation, but it seems pretty clear from the research in these reports that the deaths were due to sepsis. Now, both reports also document the consequences of the women's deaths on their families. Children, including nursing infants, were Grief-stricken fathers and other family members found it difficult to cope. The state government's payment of compensation cannot possibly make up for their loss. And so the medical violence, gender violence, and dehumanization at the clinical level spreads outwards, affecting entire families and communities. These are not isolated deaths, and I think that's an important thing to remember. And these reports do a good job of talking to the families. Otherwise, the press, will say these women died, and time passes, oh, it's an outrage, yes, but nobody considers what those deaths do to families and communities. Now, in the wake of the Chhattisgarh tragedy and others like it, there is now a push to introduce more temporary methods of contraception into the National Family Planning Program in India. Now, certainly women and men deserve more non-permanent contraceptive options. Of course they do. But as long as the Malthusian imperative remains a centerpiece of family planning delivery and medical education is biased against women and public and primary healthcare services are defunded and in dismal shape, there is a danger that non-permanent methods will be abused as well. For example, postpartum IUD insertion has taken place without women's knowledge or full informed consent. There are also worrying developments on the global population stage. Today, we are witnessing renewed alarm over the dangers and threats posed by population growth in international policy circles, the media, and Western, particularly US, environmental movements. In many ways, this is reminiscent of the population bomb scare of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, though demographically, the world is in a very different place. Change slide. As measured by total fertility rate, the average global family size is now about 2.53 children, and the demographic transition to replacement level fertility or below has occurred or is occurring in most countries, including India. In 33 sub-Saharan Africa countries, birth rates remain relatively high, but that's because of the persistence of high rates of mortality, poverty, social, economic, and gender inequalities. And of course, you could say similar things about the northern states in India that still have relatively high, although not as high as sub-Saharan Africa, fertility rates. It's due to poverty and mortality and lack of access to employment, education, and gender inequalities. It's no mystery, So, but even though the so-called population explosion is over, in absolute terms, world population is still growing and could reach between 9 to 11 billion people before it stabilizes. And this is because a large share of the population, and many of you probably know this, especially in the global south, is young and entering reproductive years. So as this cohort has children, there will be an increase in population. But this youthful momentum will peter out as birth rates continue to decline. In fact, many demographers now worry about the phenomenon of population aging. How will a shrinking supply of young people, for example, support a growing elderly population? Many demographers are extremely worried about that. Yet despite this near ubiquity of demographic transition, there is a return to the old pre-Cairo, pre-international conference on population and development paradigm, with the promotion of the injectable Depo-Provera hormonal contraceptive and long-acting reversible contraceptives like implants and IUCDs, now called by the acronym LARCs, long-acting reversible contraception, LARC. And these are being promoted as the technical contraceptive fix for the population problem. Family planning, despite the demographic transition proceeding on the international stage, family planning is once again being promoted as the centerpiece, not part of, but the centerpiece of reproductive health services. Now, why is this happening? One does ask oneself, especially at my age when I spent 30 years working with other people to try to change this overpopulation contraceptive as technical fix paradigm. Why is this happening again? In part, I would argue this is due to the entry and now growing dominance of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in the population field. And I don't want to paint everything the Gates do as bad, but in this instance, I think they're really having a negative effect. The foundation played a key role in Family Planning 2020, change slide, which aims to get 120 million more women, no, men are missing, using contraception by 2020. The Gates Foundation's position is highly problematic. It combines a kind of neo-Malthusian reasoning about population growth with an anti-abortion bias. In the sense it's the worst of both worlds. Melinda Gates refuses to support safe abortion, and there is growing concern in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field about Gates Foundation's undermining of the safe abortion agenda. So to theoretically minimize the need for abortion and reduce population growth rates, Gates and its partners have developed the Depo-Provera and LARC strategy. They claim that contraceptives will liberate women and reduce maternal mortality too. And while the population control imperative often remains hidden in these circles, it sometimes rises to the surface. For example, the long-acting and permanent methods toolkit produced by U.S. Agency for International Development and Knowledge for Health asserts, and I'm reading from it here, quote, wider availability and use of long-acting and permanent methods would reduce fertility rates more than wider use of other contraceptive methods, and countries would be able to meet their fertility goals more cost effectively. Note here, it is countries' fertility goals, not women's. Now, at the moment, the main tool in the Gates toolbox is a 3-month injectable contraceptive, Depo-Provera. This contraceptive has long been the subject of considerable medical controversy. Its known side effects include prolonged and irregular bleeding, suppression of immune response, loss of bone mineral density in young women, significant weight gain, depression, and loss of libido. There are clear racial disparities in its use, both in the US, where it is mainly promoted to women of color, and there are statistics that show that, and globally, where sub-Saharan Africa is a primary target. In July 2012, at the London Summit on Family Planning, a public-private partnership of the Gates Foundation, USAID, the UK Department for International Development, or DFID, UNFPA, Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, and the medical nonprofit PATH announced a new initiative to reach 3 million women in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia over the next 3 years, with 12 million doses of a new subcutaneous delivery form of Depo-Provera called Sayana Press. Their program is designed explicitly to reduce the need for clinics and to bring Depo-Provera to women living in some of the world's most remote regions. And their hope is eventually that women will inject themselves. Now, why this is a particularly serious development is because for over a decade now, medical studies have provided compelling evidence that Depo-Provera may increase the risk of women and their partners becoming infected with HIV. A recent study in the Lancet Infectious Diseases found a 31% heightened risk for the general population and a 40% heightened risk for sex workers and other women at greater risk of acquiring HIV. And the studies, there are some studies that say there's no risk, but I would say there are more studies showing significant risk, and it's becoming a big deal in the public health community. So I asked, why is the Gates Coalition vigorously promoting Depo-Provera in sub-Saharan Africa, a region where most of the 16 million women living with HIV are located? Furthermore, don't women in high HIV endemic areas need more access, not less, to reproductive health clinics where they can receive much-needed HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment services in addition to contraceptive access? From both an ethical and public health standpoint, then, the decision to promote Depo-Provera and the Sayana delivery press system is dubious, to put it rather nicely. Now, South Asia is also a major focus, and that's why I wanted to bring this up today. The Sayana press is currently being introduced into Bangladesh, for example, and there is growing pressure on India to accept Depo-Provera into its national family planning program as well. It's already available in some northern states through the private market. Now, women's groups in India fought long and hard to keep injectable contraceptives out of the public program. Shouldn't there at least be a vigorous public debate about Depo-Provera's safety and appropriateness for this context? Now, it may be that Depo-Provera is ultimately phased out because of HIV risk. This remains a possibility. In that case, these LARCs, next slide, change please, will become even more prominent. Critical scrutiny of them is thus also needed. They're not always simple and safe. It depends on a women's medical situation. In the States, they're mainly being targeted. You can see again communities of color down below here. Doesn't mean I'm saying all these contraceptives are bad. Certain of them might be useful in the system, but to just say that it's simple and safe is really to deny that people need good quality family planning services to use these methods appropriately and to find ones that are appropriate to their own, in each individual's specific health condition. In the Indian case, the absence of a functioning primary healthcare system, as well as the continuing dominance of population control and prejudices against the poor, mean that many poor women are unlikely to be adequately informed of these LARC risks or screened and followed up. India has made a commitment to Family Planning 2020 that 48 million more women and girls will have access to contraception by 2020. But we have to ask which contraceptives and how will they be distributed. And again, I think there needs to be a vigorous public health debate about this. The contraceptive technical fix approach essentially obscures the larger context in which these kinds of interventions take place. And here I think it's important to note the structural violence of current population policies that occurs outside of the immediate clinical context. And in particular, I'm talking here about the two-child norm and its effect to disenfranchise people, prevent people from running for office, produce increased pressure for sex selection, and also have a prejudice maternal and child benefit schemes against poor mothers and overquoted children. So there's really forms of structural health violence embedded in two-child norm state policies and also on the national level in some of these maternal and child benefit schemes that deny third children services or deny women help if they have a third or fourth child. Many Indian scholars and activists have argued forcefully that ever since 1952, the government's focus on population control has diverted resources away from public health and social welfare programs. So there's also the problem of you spend money like on these mass sterilization campaigns, but what does that mean for where's the money for basic healthcare services? Obviously, you do want family planning funded, but you also want basic healthcare services funded, and you're not going to have good family planning services until you have decent public health and primary healthcare services. So this, this diversion of resources contributes to structural violence against the poor in the form of unnecessary morbidity and mortality. And meanwhile, despite the best efforts of those trying to reform the system, it's been an uphill battle to meet people's needs for a broad array of sexual and reproductive health services in which maternity care and safe contraception and abortion figure along with sex education and age and gender sensitive services, including those for LGBTQ communities. There are many excellent sexual and reproductive health and rights efforts underway in India today. Many of you here in this room are those undertaking them. But the population control imperative stands as a block to progress. So does the Hindu right's most recent communalization of differential fertility rates between Muslims and Hindus. That also makes their job a lot harder in the current situation. As does the continuing manufacturing of economic scarcity by powerful interests. No, this current phase of capitalism, and I don't want to exactly call it neoliberalism because that's just such a catch-all term. It seems like we're in this particular phase right now, which is characterized by grotesque wealth concentration, the US and India being perfect examples. Slide change, please. Dominance of the financial sector, accelerated privatization of public services, and this is what often gets left out of the discussion, huge resources devoted to military spending. Here, would you change the slide too? And here again, the US and India are perfect examples where they spend an incredible proportion of their GDP on the military. So this kind of, this current phase of capitalism is clearly not up to the task of meeting the needs of the present population because there are demographic pressures, of course there are, but it's not up to the task of meeting the pressures now and much less the pressures of a future larger population. So this creates the illusion of economic scarcity. We just can't handle all these people. We can't handle even bigger population. But I would argue that this is an illusion. Next slide, change please. I would argue that there's kind of a scarcity cocktail being brewed here. You mix privatization, financialization, militarization, and 1% wealth concentration. You squeeze the poor and put social programs on ice. It seems to be that is like the drink of the day today. So you sip this scarcity cocktail though, and you come to believe there's just not enough to go around and population growth rates have to be forced down. Never mind the fact that the demographic transition is actually already underway. Women want birth control, but instead they get population control. So what is the way forward? In the spirit of Krishna Raj's radical humanism, the moment is right for ending the dehumanizing stranglehold Malthusian and neo-Malthusian ideologies have had over Indian population education, medical training, and the provision of health and family planning services. Malthus died over 2 centuries ago. Isn't it time to lay his ghost finally to rest? I hope so, at least before, Isn't it time to stop targeting and stereotyping poor people, especially poor women, and blaming their fertility for the nation's ills? The way population is taught naturalizes and depoliticizes the state's problematic development logics. In the name of educating the next generation, it spreads false consciousness among the population. So free the national imagination of Malthus and another world, a world where justice and equity are the central values, becomes more possible. Population and medical education are a good place to start. What if young people and medical students all over the country were to read in their textbooks that India's experiment with population control was a colossal error with unnecessary and tragic outcomes? What if they were to come to understand that it isn't the fertility of the poor preventing or slowing national development, but the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the country's ruling elites and their transnational allies? What if they were exposed to a broad, gender-sensitive sexual reproductive health and rights agenda, including early and effective sex education? What if they came to see all people as human beings like themselves, worthy of basic rights, respect, dignity, and bodily integrity? This is a tall order, yes, but the inspiring example of Krishna Raja's life's work shows us how much can be accomplished if one sets not only one's mind, but one's heart to the task of transforming consciousness and building a better nation and a better world. Thank you very much, and one more slide. I'll sit down to take questions.
Thank you very much, the efforts of critical analysis and intervention both at the level of school education and higher education is, it seems, insufficient despite our best efforts. The public sector in education is taking a back seat and opening the doors for private intervention and investment. What has been witnessed in the health sector is now the picture of education. Added to this looming presence of the private sector is a skewed nationalist ideology that wishes to flag itself as the vanguard in the global stage, and that also wishes to make itself attractive to new economic ventures. The present ruling dispensation is leading the charge, so to speak, at this critical moment in history, and it was quite reflected in your presentation as well. The use of symbolism, rhetoric, and distortions in the representation of the lives and histories of people will be the logical fallout. The content of education and the production of textbooks will be the first target of casualty in such a situation. On to existing marginal groups such as the poor and religious minorities who are considered dispensable in a nationalist universe are added newer groups marginalized on the basis of sexual orientation, gender expression, and disability, all of whom fall outside the norm. We do need actually further research and sustained campaign that makes the interconnections going beyond the domain of just population policies or programs to what Professor Hartman alluded as the political economy of inequality, to which we need to add political economy of public health and education. We need this, foregrounding gender and other marginalities. As a student of women's studies, we notice a dearth of this attention both in research, teaching, and networking. It was only as recent as 2008 that the Indian Association of Women's Studies focused on education as a theme of its national conference titled Feminism, Education, and Transformation of Knowledges. Engaging with education, knowledge production as an institutional, ideological, ethical, and political apparatus. The right wing of all views, especially the economic and the cultural, needless to say, is always one step ahead. Another important concern that needs to be underlined within public health, which has engaged with population education, is that of sexuality education and the studies that it has led to. It is important to see that the continuity between population education of the 1960s and the 70s and the sexuality studies. And here I acknowledge the work of Nandini Mandrekar, who has written a book on sexuality for young people. Population education, when it appeared in school curriculum in 1970, was to inculcate in students the national values of the small family norm, linking underdevelopment and poverty with sexual profligacy of the poor, something that you also alluded to. But by the 90s, this ideology and message of population development had become the norm, reflected in textbooks across the country. The context that subsequently emerged, the HIV/AIDS prevention initiatives, which of course gave visibility and space to those marginalized on basis of gender and sexuality. But these initiatives and the funding from not just multilateral agencies but private foundations, as you mentioned, has given sexuality education an outsider status. But it has also been picked up for engagement by groups and NGOs with whom traditional social and political movements refuse to have a truck with. The content and approach, unless critically addressed by the few, for instance the Sama and their Antar and subgroups, become very instrumental and reduced to life skills or adolescence education that then become the purview of these NGOs and groups far removed from the institutions of education. So there is this disjuncture between the mainstream public sector and within school curriculum as well, adolescence education becomes positive and responsible behavior with values that are fast disappearing due to changing lifestyle. The policy discourse both nationally and globally views adolescent youth as either agents of change or delinquents. There is the good and the bad, like earlier women versus the good women and the bad women in the nation's development. Finally, in education as in health, technical or technological solutions are seen as fixes rather than a comprehensive and democratic understanding and action. Technology or technical solutions by itself are unable to go beyond the deep social divisions and disjunctures at the material and discursive level. In fact, technology increasingly provided by private initiatives creates divides rather than addressing them. Issues such as skill development in the contemporary moment are areas that need critical interrogation, especially when the mean years of schooling of informal workers, both male and female, ranges between 3 years for rural women and 7 years for urban men, according to NSSO 2004-5. People are removed many levels from one another in imagining this. We need a constructive synthesis and integration of those who are part of campaigns and movements and those who are within the research and policy discussions. partial and ahistorical exercise has then become an easy route for even funders, both national and international, through their corporate social responsibilities to seek returns. So I wish to thank you, Professor Hartman, for this engaging overview and urging a reformulation of older questions in the contemporary context, foregrounding interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches that are imperative today. So with that few words, I now open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Professor Hartman, for that very educational talk. I have two questions. One, in a country or rather in a society where women do not yet control or rather have control over their reproductive rights, if incentive to control population, if you remove state entirely out of the equation, what then happens? And I was not very clear regarding your position about this is the second part of the question about what do you think is the effect of population explosion on environment.
Thank you. Yeah, those are good. Good. One thing is that many women want access to birth control. They may not be things may not be great for them in many ways, but there's really a small family norm here in most of India, right? So if you have services that provide, good quality counseling, screening, good quality contraceptive delivery, regular delivery, treat women with respect, also encourage men to use contraceptives and get involved and provide sexuality education, other reproductive health services. That's an incentive enough. You don't have to drag people in. People want to use birth control, so if you can provide those services, and the state should provide those services, then that's incentive enough. It's people want services, but what they're getting instead is these kind of top-down sterilization programs and real, disrespect and lack of healthcare services. That would be my answer there. Secondly, what is population growth's effect on the environment? Well, it's a complicated issue, and so population is mediated by so many other factors in terms of its environmental impact. Economy, history, so that it's hard to have one general rule that overpopulation is the cause of environmental degradation, for example. The Malthusian logic is way too simple. There may be cases where there is demographic pressure on the environment, but sometimes it's demographic pressure of things. For example, living in Delhi or driving through the streets of Mumbai, one senses there's an overpopulation of cars. Okay, but so so that could also be a problem. I think also the Malthusian view that overpopulation is the main cause of environmental degradation really obscures the role of powerful, like extractive industries like coal mines or nuclear power plants or the military. The military is one of the primary causes of environmental degradation in the world. Militaries worldwide. The U.S. military in particular is probably the single. It is the single largest user of transportation fuel in the world. Okay, so it contributes to climate change in a big way. It hardly is ever mentioned in climate change debates, and instead, I didn't talk about it here, but there's a move afoot of some population and environment groups, not all, but some, to blame climate change on overpopulation and say that family planning will somehow magically mitigate climate change, and that family planning will also magically help poor women adapt to climate change. It's a real, it's kind of jumping on the climate change bandwagon. And again, I'm very concerned about climate change. And these kind of false solutions are false. And I'm also concerned that people have access to reproductive health services. But these false linkages are very problematic. And they start to divert the gaze away from powerful interests. And also, I would argue in the U.S. case, that particularly, it's broken, there are possible solidarities between environmental movements in the U.S. and elsewhere. But the mainstream environmental movements persistent focus on population. It kind of paints poor women as these women over there that need to be saved to save the planet. And it prevents kind of solidarity between groups that are really taking on the forces of environmental degradation. And there are good examples of environmental justice and climate justice movements worldwide that are coming together in solidarity across national borders. And this Malthusian ideology serves to break those linkages. So I think it's very pernicious that way.
Thank you for that very comprehensive and extremely wonderful and meaningful, nuanced presentation. It was really a remarkable presentation. I just wish to draw attention to the role of the various feminist movements. Here I'm talking of the first wave feminist movement as well as the subsequent one, through which it is possible to trace, and somewhere along what we do see in the first wave feminist movement, which did start as a need to give women reproductive rights over their bodies. It gets entwined with the Malthusian League, etc. And the differences that come in with the pioneers who started as the supporters of reproductive rights for women, how their own discourse gets transformed to population control. And the differences between the British feminists and the American feminists, where Margaret Sanger's view also was very strongly Malthusian in many ways. So I think the aspect or the role that women and feminists have also played in this entire discourse and the changes that have come in subsequently also become a very, very complex issue in this debate.
You're absolutely right. And even Margaret Sanger, who was the kind of founder of the birth control movement in the U.S., was a complicated figure because in her early years she was very much into women's liberation and birth control as and sexual liberation, right? But it wasn't tied to eugenics and population control. And then she made a strategic decision to make an alliance with the eugenics movement in order to get more support, and became increasingly conservative in her later years. So she's one of these big fights in the women's movement in the U.S., and especially between kind of more uncritical first wave feminists or second wave feminists and feminists of color over her legacy. So yes, absolutely. And one of the problems in the States too, I would say, that makes this issue more complex is that we have a very strong and powerful anti-abortion lobby, right? And so if you criticize, which is also anti-contraception in many ways, so people are very afraid in feminist movements to criticize certain forms of contraception or to raise issues about population control because they fear the anti-abortion lobby will seize on these issues, which they do. They take our own rhetoric and use it. So it becomes very complicated. But I always say that silence is not golden, and that if feminists and progressive people don't speak out and take the moral high ground on population control abuses, we cede the moral high ground to the anti-abortion movement, and that's politically disastrous. So I think it's really important that, and I think many people in the population field who are more in the population control direction did start changing after Cairo. Not all of them, unfortunately. But there's never been a real coming to terms or saying, we did it wrong, or really kind of, I don't know, there's just been a kind of lack of historical reflection, which I think helps in the current moment to allow this resurgence of neo-Malthusianism to be happening in the population field. And I know many in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field are concerned about it, but they need to really speak out against it, because if they
the poor. They are the same one who very enthusiastically support assisted reproduction, whether they are medical professionals or medical bodies, employers, organization. In city like Mumbai, most of the abortion clinics have now become assisted reproduction clinics. This is not only reality of metropolis, but even in tier 2, tier 3 cities, even places like Madurai or Surat. Everywhere assisted reproduction clinics are coming. All mainstream newspapers are publishing one page, very aggressive advertisement is taking place. So I think it's a question of selective breeding. I think it's a repetition of what was happening in the World War II, where Nazis wanted white, tall, handsome, intelligent German women to do intensive breeding, and the Jewish women had to be sterilized. Singapore adopted the same policy where Malay Muslim women had to be sterilized, and white Chinese educated English knowing women, they had to do massive breeding. So in the elite organizations, you hear this kind of argument very, very strongly, and I think that's why I think we need to expose this game, this contradictory attitude. It's basically the anti-poor and anti-religious minority, because now same Hindu leaders are telling Hindu women to produce 10 children,
Yes,
you
yes,
know, and Muslim women, they
yes.
have to be forcibly sterilized, or they go to the extent of saying that you need to have periodic riots to exterminate
Right.
Muslim population because of the breeding by Muslims.
Yeah, I think the new reproductive technologies, I mean, part of the drive, of course, is money, right? And it's a new market, right, in body parts and reproductive technology, but it also serves as an ideological, whether it would really become the source of a huge eugenics program or not is another question. But it serves to, especially, the idea that you want eggs from beautiful white in U.S. Women who go to Ivy League schools get paid $10,000 to donate, so-called sell their eggs, while people who go to inferior schools get paid less. I mean, so what is this saying about, and that the whole idea that it's genes also that produce the person, right? It goes back to that kind of very simplistic genetics. So I sometimes wonder if there's an ideological function going on here too as well, whether it's not going to be so much in practice, but if it performs, it performs a certain role in the moment. And I agree with you also about the kind of shocking use of communal narratives around fertility. Just arriving in India in January and reading more about that and kind of the return of saffron demography. Well, not that it ever went away, but now they haven't even released the results of the 2011 census, right? I mean, it's being leaked to the press a bit, and so the Muslim population may have grown a bit faster than the Hindu population, mainly because Muslim population is probably poorer, and having a few more children. But why is that such a problem? Why is that painted as such a problem? And again, why are then white women, Hindu women, told to go out and have more babies? And one of the things about this, I think, differential fertility argument is used here in India. It's also used in Europe now, where white women are being told that they should have more babies so they don't have to have more Muslim immigrants come into the country for the workforce. So the same kind of arguments are being used, and the anti-abortion movement even using it. White women are having too many abortions in Europe. So I think we need to monitor these ideologies, and then how they also the political economy underlying the business too, and how the business benefits from some of these ideologies, especially the idea that you need a kind of genetically perfect child, what that means. So I don't know if that's useful. I know that wonderful work is being done here in India on assisted reproductive technologies. And here, I'd just like to say, I have learned so much about assisted reproductive technology, population control, and political ways to challenge those things through the Indian women's movement and the importance of, I don't know if this is true or not, and I'd like to throw this out, but that there hasn't been as much emphasis on contraceptives recently, kind of looking critically at contraceptives, and I'm thinking that it's a moment to revive that discourse, that it's really important that people look. I think there's so many other things to keep an eye on, but that really needs to be.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I think that that's really true, and there's so much to be done, and there's so many um, positive linkages that can be made between, you know, women's movements and climate justice and environmental justice movements. You know, because there are people all over the world organizing on a more of a climate justice basis, the kind of arguments that Center for Science and Environment made back when they are very much central in the climate justice movement. So I think there are a lot of possibilities for progressive action, also action around gender and climate change, but not population and climate change. There's possibilities there as well. It's interesting, the Chinese government at the Copenhagen climate conference, their I guess it was their population minister or something, made the claim that China, by preventing the one-child policy, by preventing 400 million births, was one of China's main contributions to climate change. Yeah. So, and one interesting thing about the one-child policy is demographers now in China, some of them are getting braver and speaking out that it was never necessary, that birth rates were going down anyway because of rising living standards, and that it was all a colossal era. And so, but at the same time, you have the government using it as a kind of a, ideologically as its contribution. Fortunately, they are starting to talk about reduce emissions. Um, so, yeah, and in the case of India too, I think there are a lot of possibilities. You know, for example, if you reduced pollution in Delhi and Mumbai through curtailing private automobiles and increasing public transport and other measures, that would really have great health benefits, especially for poor people. So there's all kinds of ways to design climate policies that really benefit poor people, and you know, don't make them bear the burden. And certainly transitions. I mean, I frankly do believe we need a massive transition out of fossil fuels. But how does that occur in countries like India and China that are rapidly developing and have the right to rapidly develop? But who is benefiting in that development process here? Who is benefiting here from, you know, taking over land in, you know, in certain states for coal mines and extraction, and you know, who is benefiting by this persistent use of fossil fuel here, and why can't there be an energy transition to other forms of clean and renewable energy? So it always comes down to power and political economy in the end, and I think the women's movement absolutely, I think every movement needs to at least be literate about climate change and climate policy. Doesn't mean it has to be their central issue, but and the climate movement itself also has to realize that it needs to be literate about these other issues too. And in that process, you can build alliances. You know, there are some people, especially on the left in the US, who say climate change is like the next big movement. It's going to change the world. Everybody's going to come together. It's the next revolution, really. Well, I'm not sure that's true, but we need to address climate change in whatever way we can across social movements, and it is a way to come together.
I think on that fascinating note, without adding anything further, but taking ahead the reflections that you have given in this fascinating lecture. Uh, so thank you very much, and on behalf of organizers, we'll go on to. Thank you very much,
Thank
Ms.
you.
Khan.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Betsy, for a wonderful lecture. Thank you, Professor Meena